So this Kendrick Lamar and SZA interview, I was so excited to find out that this happened because I've been saying over and over again how I feel like it's so important for these artists who are producing work that is inviting conversations on a scale that we haven't seen in culture in a while. I think it's so important if they're inviting these conversations to clarify what they mean about things. And I feel like for the modern artist, with accessibility being such a normal thing, it makes sense when an artist is popular enough not to have to be accessible. It makes sense that they use that as part of the marketing, in a sense, leaving breadcrumbs, leaving things open to interpretation, engaging the fans' imagination. So you get the Kendrick Lamar lyric analysis cottage industry on YouTube and Substacks and Mediums and various other places. I understand the power of that, but I think on the other side of that power is a danger. I've said this before, but I have a friend who is a mixed race person who told me that they were in a situation where, because part of the conversation in Kendrick and Drake was about the validity of Drake's blackness and Drake's mixed raceness as a function of his blackness, that when the song Not Like Us was released, and because the we and the us was not defined, this person was put into a position where they had to defend their blackness. This was a mixed race person who I'm speaking about, because they were around people who took the intent of Not Like Us to be about the validity of blackness, because that was part of the conversation that was being had with Drake. Now, do I think that artists are to be blamed for the ignorance of people making interpretations? Not necessarily, but I do think it invites a little bit of responsibility in the Peter Parker sense, the with great power sense, the Uncle Ben sense. So I was happy to find out that Kendrick did an interview. There's been a lot of chatter in the rap hip hop pundit space about whether artists should do interviews, but from a perspective of, should artists be giving stories to rap journalists in order to validate rap journalism as an important part of the hip hop culture experience? Do I think that, would it be cool if Kendricks and Drakes and J. Cole's gave interviews to people who have been instrumental in putting spotlights on the journeys of these artists and what they're making and helping that get to people? Because all of these artists didn't start really huge, right? There was a time when J. Cole was underground, when Drake was underground, when Kendrick was coming up. At that time, they depended on rap writers and journalists and media to highlight what they were doing and get it out to people to help them rise. Do I think it would be good to keep those corners of the culture validated? Absolutely. But this interview is not with a media person. This interview is with SZA. And after reading it, I felt like this was actually way better than if he had done this interview with somebody in the media. Because what becomes very obvious when you go through this interview is that Kendrick has a certain amount of comfort with SZA, and likewise, and that they have a certain amount of trust with each other. And I think for the sensitivity of some of these subjects, that trust is very important. I could see a situation where Kendrick sits down with Time magazine and Jeffrey Stormbreaker, whoever, that's a great writer, but Kendrick doesn't have that rapport with, that familiarity with, and he might not trust where Jeffrey is coming from. So the conversations around these sensitive subjects could be defensive. But it's so clear that there's a mutual respect, comfort, and familiarity with these two artists that they're able to go some very unexpected places in this conversation and really shed light on some of this stuff in a way that I felt was really illuminating, challenging, I would even say inspiring. Let's get into it. The beginning of it is just setting up the conversation with SZA and Kendrick Lamar sitting down to have this. Look at this pouty guy. Look at this pout. This pout is so funny to me. This pout is funny to me because it's so unnatural. Nobody's face does that. People's faces only do this for fashion photographs. Nobody has ever made this face naturally, ever. So they shot a movie. They're shooting a movie. So it starts out with them talking about this movie. Then they get quickly into mental health. Kendrick talks about growing up with the term mental health. SZA asking him if he identifies with it. And so this is one of the first important points that I felt like it touched on. Kendrick says, my whole thing is it's all experience. I say some shit on a record and identify with the moment, and then I don't identify with it anymore. If that's just growth for me, all that shit is subjective. SZA says it's giving self-therapy. Kendrick says, I think it's going back to my inner child, right? I was trying to understand myself, trying to find people I could relate to, how to identify myself outside myself. It sounds crazy to a lot of people. I really can see myself out of my body. When I do that, I have no judgment toward it. It's too many eyes on me to not remove myself. That shit is scary to anybody else. That like shook me to read that. One of the things I learned very early on in music, and independent music specifically, when we don't have a lot of staff and support and A&Rs and music executives around us, it's very important for artists in our position to make what we make and also be able to see what we've made outside of ourselves to help to be able to put it in a context. It is one of like the most important skills that we have to develop as artists in the indie space, because we have to be able to understand where the work sits in the greater context of art and culture and life. Because what you want to happen as an artist is you make shit, give it to people, and they're like, this is fucking awesome. Here, have $1 million. Nothing works that way, especially if you're trying to make anything that's even slightly challenging. So being able to see yourself outside of yourself is such an important skill. SZA asks him, are you scared? Kendrick says, no, because I've learned that I can identify with my performances on stage. I can't hold my true identity to that person who's on stage, because if I did, that means I will judge every moment, every time I fuck up a lyric, every time I'm off key. It's too much to deal with. So I have to have the distance between the performer and the person I close my eyes and look at the ceiling with. I had to develop that tough skin at like 16, 17 years old, not knowing it was not only for my career, but for myself. It's mentally ill for sure. So that's a little bit of disassociation, but that's a disassociation for protection. And that's something that I've talked about and thought about a lot too. A lot of this, I'm going to be giving my insight on as an artist and how these words hit my nervous system as an artist. I've talked a lot about having to understand that who I am on stage is and has to be a very different person than who I am off stage. I've learned that for myself, I require a few minutes of transition between who I am on stage, especially for like a solo show, and who I have to be when I'm communicating with people before or after the show. Because when I'm on stage, I have to engage parts of myself that take up the entire room. My ego, my creativity, my belief in myself have to grow to that size. But I can't be that same size when I'm off stage, selling merch, settling with the promoter, the other hats that I have to wear. I can't be that same size. So it became very important for me to learn which parts of myself I have to engage where and what's needed for me to do that in a way that doesn't drive me insane. It's very honest. Speaking of honesty and ego, have you done ayahuasca? SZA asked him. He says he hasn't done it. Uh, so that makes her wonder how he's arriving at all these conclusions about spiritual practices. She asked how many spiritual practices contribute to his day to day. He said all day, every day. She says all day a ceremony. He says yes. Ain't no bullshit. Ain't no cliche. I literally talk to God like it's to a point where I'll be starting to think I'm going crazy. Then he has to remind me, no, this is really me. My early morning practices that I have to run. When I started running, that's where I started to understand. There was this threshold of pain and spirituality for me. I remember my shins was aching and I was like, I got 1 mile to go. Then I get whispers and downloads and start talking about shit that I want to know about. And the next thing, I'm 3 miles in, 4 miles in. I wake up and do that shit every day. SZA says, loss of self. You have to break yourself. Kendrick says, I have to. I thought that part was really interesting. That's probably the part that is most difficult for me to process because my own feelings about cosmology, religion, I consider myself agnostic. Literally, I do not know what is out there. And I've often yearned for the certainty in which some people seem to have with their communion with whatever force exists is greater than us. And where it's been few and far between where I found any sort of certainty that way, the one thing that really resonated with me about what he was saying here is that I've always felt that any practice or process that is serious about trying to find that connection to the thing that's larger than us has to come with some sort of physical discipline. In his case, it's running. He had to run until his ego was broken, basically. Part of the issue that I've had with religion in the experiences of it in my life is that a lot of the traditional Christian practices that I've experienced are not holistic in that there is no physical discipline associated with it. It's a reading or a praying, but there's no component to it that deals with the body. In my experience, that creates a split between my mental self and my physical self that doesn't help me to achieve what it is you're supposed to be achieving. People's goals might be different, but mine being that connection to the larger, the idea of the thing larger than ourselves. To me, it's got to have some sort of physical aspect to it. So yoga has gotten me there at times when I've done Kundalini yoga, because you can have a mantra, something for the mind, but there's also a connection that seeks to be built with the body. And that has always felt more effective to me. He talks about his parents and why it's been hard for him to develop vulnerability in the household he grew up in. SZA talks about how her mom grew up dark skinned in the 50s and didn't have much and was not allowed to be herself. And so that in SZA's expression of self, sometimes it's put her mom in a position where she feels somewhat embarrassed or even somewhat embarrassed at having some wealth now and having things to call her own, having a house to renovate. I thought that was particularly touching too, just in a generational sense. Her mother had to shrink herself down to fit the space that society kept for her. Now her daughter, through creativity and fortune in the business, has gotten to be so big, so expressive, take up so much space that her mom has had some discomfort in dealing with that. I thought that was really touching too. She talks about him feeling teachable, and she says her problem is that she's not teachable. That's my problem, because I always be like either in my fear or do some shit. I have a low pain tolerance, but a high competition tolerance. That shit hit me like a ton of bricks. A low pain tolerance, but high competition tolerance. Like, I feel like I'm going to be chewing on that sentence for weeks because I either have that exact same thing or I have the exact opposite. Like, I might have a low competition tolerance but high pain tolerance. Like, there is a sentiment being expressed about two categories here and their relationship to each other that I have never fucking thought about before, but that shit hit me right in the chest. Right in the fucking chest. In this field, in creativity, and specifically in selling creativity for a living, there is so much pain and so much competition, and there does seem to be a visceral connection between the two. And I feel like for me, internally, figuring out what that relationship is going to bear a lot of fucking fruit for me. So this was really interesting too. She says, you have such father time energy. It's universal dad vibes. Actually, it's more universal sensei. It's almost gender ambiguous. It's father and mother because you actually seem quite in tune with your feminine energy. Do you consider yourself in touch with your feminine side? He says, I have to balance both. At first, all I knew was the masculinity, and I always kept that wall up because of my pops. Now, I'm going to tell you this answer, this response, and it's so good and it's so real and it's so enlightening into his journey as an artist, where he's been, where he comes from. And this is, I don't think this is the answer you would have gotten if he sat down with Time Magazine and Jeffrey Stormbreaker, who I just made that name up. Please do not think that is a real person. I think this is an insight you only get with him sitting with an artist that he also respects. So then she asked, "Can I ask you a hypermasculine question?" And this to me was so important to the whole thing, especially given that I think it's really important for him to define what some of these notions mean in the context of this rap battle. What does "not like us" mean to you? And he says, laughing, "Not like us. Not like us is the energy of who I am, the type of man I represent. Now, if you identify with the man that I represent," and then she says, "break that down for me. This man has morals, he has values, he believes in something, he stands on something, he's not pandering. He's a man who can recognize his mistakes and not be afraid to share the mistakes, and can dig deep down into fear-based ideologies or experience to be able to express them without feeling like he's less of a man. If I'm thinking of not like us, I'm thinking of me and whoever identifies with that." So I love that as an answer. Now, I think that answer demands further attention. I think that answer demands further analysis. I'm glad that "not like us" is not ambiguous. I'm glad that the us and the them is not ambiguous, first of all. Where this answer leads me to want to ask, though, who else does he think is like him? Is he saying that the people who he associates with all have these morals and values and believe in something and stand on something and aren't pandering? Is he saying that everybody he associates with is a man who can recognize his mistakes, not be afraid to share the mistakes, and dig deep down into fear-based ideologies? I went to the pop out and I was completely with the vibe. I was completely in it. I thought it was such an awesome thing to experience. But I also felt a little confused that he brought out Dr. Dre. If I'm not mistaken, he specifically brought out Dr. Dre to do the intro to "Not Like Us." Because is this saying that Dr. Dre is like him when it comes to these aspects? The way that he's defined this song. Because among things in Dr. Dre's past include beating up D Barnes in public and joking about it in magazine interviews, that I've never heard him address that. I've never heard him recognize that mistake and not be afraid to share the mistakes and dig down deep into fear-based ideologies about that particular instance or any other thing that he, may have been alleged to do. So to me, there's more to be unpacked here if this is the definition that he's going with. And I'm interested in unpacking it more, not because I'm going on witch hunts for dudes who have done wrong, or like that's. I just think it's such an important conversation to have. I think that what he's talking about here is such a transformative thing, especially within the black community, that I want to fully have the conversation. I want the conversation to be fully had. This is a very big idea. This is a potentially powerful idea, especially within hip hop. I'd love to have it engaged with in terms of some of the people that we lift up and just to talk it through. Oh, she hit me with this one too. She hit me with this one too. She hit me real hard with this one too. She says, I wrote a song last summer that was too honest and I couldn't put it out. Wow. Y'all. So some of y'all have been Morning Gang for a while. You've been in the Secret Club on Discord for a while and on Patreon. And if you have been, you know about some of my Dark, Dark Purple songs. I put out a tape a few years back called the Dark, Dark Purple Tape. And those were all songs that I had written throughout the dark comedy era, throughout the Brick Body Kids era, throughout the What Happens When I Try to Relax era, that all felt too honest. That all felt too honest. That I felt like I couldn't put out. So it really hit me when she wrote that. It just really resonates with me as somebody who has a lot of these internal battles with things that I feel like I need to contend with and confront in art. But then when it comes to trying to sell art, sometimes those things don't feel like they fit. My Anime Trauma and Divorce album was one of the first times where I said I was going to fully put out songs that I felt like were too honest in that way and try to stand behind it as a product. And I feel like to some degree that cost me something. Like that wasn't an easy thing to do. And I don't know if I'm ever going to completely do that again, because the vulnerability felt like it was more than I had the support to really be able to deal with. And that's me. Like I would say, I think I face business wise, clearly a lot less pressure than somebody like SZA does. A lot less pressure. And I still go through these same mental gymnastics trying to make art. So I could only imagine how intense this shit is for her. I don't know. It gives me a fantastic insight into her creativity, and I think that's so fucking admirable to say shit like that. She says, I got to do what you're doing. Your philosophy of when it gets too hot, that's when you got to go like closer through it, all the way through until your shins is burning. I want to take it there. And that resonated with me too. I remember I was watching the George Carlin documentary when that came out a few years ago. And he was sharing with, or he had shared with one of his close friends, who I also believe was a comedian. I can't remember who was saying this quote in the documentary. But it was later on in Carlin's career, maybe the midpoint of what ultimately became his career. And at that point, there were a lot of younger comedians who were sharper, edgier, and a lot of them were kind of making fun of him. His style had gotten to be cookie cutter-ish, to the point where these up-and-coming comics could pretty easily synthesize his act into these little bite-sized, make-funnable chunks. And he said it scared him. But this person said, if you know anything about creativity, when you're scared of something, that's exactly what you have to lean into. And that kicked my ass when I heard that. There's a lot to be scared of when you're making shit. There's a lot to be scared of, or even more to be scared of when you're making shit and trying to sell it. And it's so easy to allow fear to guide what you're doing because you think you're being cautious and you think you're avoiding mistakes. But I've learned over and over again that the most powerful shit happens when you lean into what you're afraid of. And I feel like that's what Kendrick just communicated to SZA in this interview. And it feels like that's ultimately going to be her takeaway from it too. When it gets too hot, you got to go even closer to it. But that's where the juice is. That's where the true self-challenge is when you make the shit that's scary. But it is that tightrope, right? Because I don't think that everything I make is for everybody to hear. But I do think if I'm afraid of something, there's a conversation inside of me that needs to be had. And regardless of whether or not what comes out of that is a song for everybody or a song just for me, I think the important thing is that I have the damn conversation. And that's about it. Like and subscribe, homie, friend. It's free. Stop playing.